The morning sun cast long shadows across the New Mexico territory as Thomas McKenna urged his horse up the rocky ridge overlooking his ranch. The year was 1878, and the land he called home remained as wild and unpredictable as the day he first arrived 15 years ago. Below him stretched thousands of acres of scrubland dotted with cattle, but his mind wasn't on the livestock that morning. Smoke rose from the direction of his southern pasture, and not the kind that came from campfires. McKenna had built his ranch through sheer determination and back-breaking work. At 42, his hands bore the calluses of a man who understood that survival in this territory meant being prepared for anything. The Apache raids had become more frequent in recent months, and several neighboring ranches had lost cattle, horses, and worse. Yet something about this particular smoke troubled him more than usual. As he rode closer, the acrid smell of burning grass filled his nostrils. His prize bull, Thunder, lay dead near the water hole, but the animal hadn't been butchered for meat. 3 of his best horses were missing, their tracks leading southeast toward the Chiricahua Mountains. McKenna dismounted and studied the ground with the keen eye of a man who had learned to read the desert like a book. The tracks told a story that surprised him. Unlike the chaotic patterns left by most raiding parties, these prints showed discipline and purpose. Someone had specifically targeted his finest animals and had done so with remarkable skill. Most troubling of all, one set of tracks stood out from the rest. The moccasin prints were smaller than the others, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left sole. A woman had led this raid. McKenna followed the trail for several miles before losing it in the rocky terrain near Apache Creek. As he turned back toward his ranch, movement caught his eye. A figure sat motionless on a distant ridge, watching him. Even at that distance, he could see the erect posture and long black hair that confirmed his suspicions. The Apache woman who had taken his horses was bold enough to observe him in broad daylight. Their eyes met across the valley for a long moment before she disappeared over the ridge like smoke in the wind. McKenna sat in his saddle, struck by something he couldn't quite name. In that brief glimpse, he had seen not just a raider, but someone whose presence commanded the very landscape around her. The encounter left him unsettled in ways that had nothing to do with his missing livestock. When McKenna returned to the ranch house that evening, his foreman, Jake Patterson, was waiting with news that made the day's events even more complex. Patterson, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, rarely showed concern. Tonight, worry lines creased his face. "Tom, we got bigger problems than missing horses," Patterson said as McKenna unsaddled his mount. "Riders came through about an hour ago, federal marshal and 2 soldiers from Fort Bowie. They're hunting Apache raiders, and they think our missing stock is connected to a war party that hit the Jameson spread yesterday." McKenna paused in his work. The Jameson Ranch lay 20 miles east, and if the same group had struck both spreads, it suggested a larger operation than he had initially thought. What did the marshal want? "Permission to use our land as a base for tracking operations. I told them you'd be back by sunset." Patterson spat tobacco juice into the dust. "They're camped by the creek waiting for your answer. But Tom, there's something else. Mrs. Jameson was killed in yesterday's raid. The marshal's talking about organizing a volunteer force to track down the war party." The news hit McKenna like a physical blow. Mary Jameson had been one of the few women in the territory who understood the challenges of ranch life. Her death transformed the situation from a matter of stolen livestock to something far more serious. The federal authorities would now pursue the raiders with lethal intent, and the delicate balance that had allowed many ranchers to coexist peacefully with local Apache bands would be shattered. That night, McKenna met with Marshal William Garrett and Lieutenant Samuel Morrison around a campfire near the creek. Garrett was a lean man with steel-gray eyes who had spent years tracking outlaws across the Southwest. Morrison represented the Army's growing impatience with Apache resistance to reservation life. Both men radiated the kind of righteous anger that McKenna knew would lead to tragedy if not carefully managed. "Mr. McKenna, we have confirmation that the same war party hit both ranches," Garrett said, producing a leather pouch from his saddlebags. "Found this at the Jameson place. Apache work, but high quality. Whoever made this knows traditional techniques that most reservation Indians have abandoned." McKenna examined the beadwork on the pouch. The craftsmanship was indeed exceptional, showing the kind of skill passed down through generations of Apache women. The geometric patterns told stories that only someone deeply versed in the culture could create. As he studied the intricate design, an image flashed in his mind of the woman on the ridge, her bearing suggesting someone who carried the weight of tradition and responsibility. "What exactly are you asking of me, Marshal?" McKenna said, handing back the pouch. "We want to use your ranch as a staging area for pursuit operations. The tracks lead into the mountains, but they'll have to come down for water eventually. Your spread has the best vantage points for monitoring the main trails." Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, his young face reflecting the eagerness of an officer seeking to prove himself in combat. "Sir, we believe this war party may be operating under orders from Geronimo's faction. If we can capture or eliminate them quickly, it will send a message to other potential raiders." McKenna considered the request carefully. Allowing the federal forces to operate from his land would provide protection for his ranch, but it would also make him a target for retaliation. More troubling was his growing suspicion that the situation was more complex than it appeared. The disciplined nature of the raids, the precision of the targeting, and most of all, the image of the woman on the ridge suggested motivations beyond simple raiding. "I'll give you permission to use my land, but with conditions," McKenna said finally. "No shooting unless fired upon first, and if you encounter Apache civilians, especially women and children, you treat them with respect. This territory has seen enough bloodshed from misunderstandings." Marshal Garrett nodded agreement, but Morrison's expression showed less enthusiasm for such restrictions. "Mr. McKenna, with respect, these people have already demonstrated their hostility. Mrs. Jameson's death proves they're willing to kill innocent civilians. Lieutenant, I've lived in this territory longer than you've been in the Army. I've learned that things aren't always what they appear to be. Until we know more about why these raids are happening, we proceed with caution. Over the next 3 days..." McKenna worked alongside the federal forces while conducting his own investigation. The marshal's men established observation posts on the ridges overlooking the main water sources, while McKenna used his knowledge of local terrain to identify alternative routes the raiders might use. During this time, he began to notice details that the federal officers had missed. The raids were indeed systematic, but they weren't random violence. Someone had carefully studied the ranches, identifying the best livestock while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. At his own spread, the raiders had taken only what they needed and had killed his bull only when the animal refused to be moved. At the Jameson Ranch, the evidence suggested that Mary Jameson's death had been accidental, occurring when she surprised the raiders and was trampled by panicked horses. Most intriguingly, McKenna found evidence that the raiders had been watching the ranches for weeks before striking. Hidden observation posts in the hills showed signs of extended occupation, complete with carefully concealed fire pits and water storage. Someone had planned these operations with military precision, but the level of caution suggested a defensive rather than aggressive motivation. On the 4th morning of the search, McKenna rode alone to check his southern boundary fence. As he crested a small hill, he found her waiting for him. The Apache woman sat her horse with casual confidence about 50 yards away, her dark eyes studying him with the same intensity he had felt during their first encounter. This time, however, she made no move to flee. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of natural grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in harmony with the harsh landscape around her. Her clothes were traditional Apache dress, but modified for practicality, and she carried herself with an authority that suggested leadership rather than mere participation in raiding activities. For several minutes, they simply observed each other across the distance. McKenna felt his heart beating faster, but not from fear. There was something about this woman that challenged every assumption he had made about the recent raids. Her presence radiated strength and intelligence, but also a sadness that spoke of burdens carried for others. Finally, she urged her horse forward, stopping just outside easy rifle range. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, with the slight accent that marked someone who had learned the language as a second tongue. "You are the rancher McKenna. You hunt with the blue soldiers, but you do not shoot at shadows like they do. Why?" The directness of her question surprised him. McKenna had expected either hostility or silence, not this forthright inquiry about his motivations. "Because shooting at shadows never solved anything. My name is Thomas McKenna. What should I call you?" She considered his question for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him with something valuable. "I am called Ayana, daughter of Chief Nalnish. You have lost horses and a bull. I have come to speak of these things." The revelation that she was a chief's daughter explained much about her bearing and authority. It also raised the stakes of their conversation considerably. If Ayana was acting under her father's orders, the raids represented a coordinated effort by a significant Apache band. If she was acting independently, the situation was even more complex. "Speak then," McKenna said, dismounting from his horse to show peaceful intentions. "I'm listening." Ayana remained mounted, maintaining the tactical advantage of mobility. "Your soldiers seek to punish my people for taking what we need to survive. But they do not ask why we must take instead of trade, as our people did in the old days." "Then tell me why." "Because the White Eyes have broken every promise made to Chief Nalnish. They said our people could remain in our mountain homes if we kept peace. They said we could trade horses and goods for the things we needed. But the agent at the reservation steals the food meant for our children. He trades our rations for whiskey and gold, then tells the soldiers that we are thieves when we take what was promised to us." The accusation hit McKenna with the force of revelation. Corruption among Indian agents was an open secret throughout the territory, but he had never connected it directly to the recent increase in raiding activities. If Ayana spoke the truth, her people were caught between the slow starvation of reservation life and the violent response that theft would bring from federal authorities. "The woman who was killed at the Jameson Ranch," McKenna said carefully, "was her death intended?" Pain flickered across Ayana's features. "No, Spotted Horse was trying to move the animals quietly. The woman came from her house with a rifle. The horses panicked, and she was knocked down. Spotted Horse tried to help her, but she was already dying. He carries great shame for this accident." The admission confirmed McKenna's own investigation, but it also revealed something else. These raids were being conducted by people who retained enough humanity to feel remorse for unintended casualties. The picture emerging was not of savage warriors bent on destruction, but of desperate people trying to survive in an increasingly impossible situation. "What do you want from me?" McKenna asked. "The soldiers will follow our trail into the mountains. They will attack our camp and kill women and children to punish warriors for what we have done. This is their way." Ayana's voice carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much violence. "But you have influence with them. You could speak for a different path." "What different path?" "Meet with my father. Learn the truth of what has happened to our people. Then decide if we are the thieves and murderers your soldiers believe us to be." The proposal was dangerous on multiple levels. Meeting with Chief Nalnish without military escort could be seen as treasonous by federal authorities. It would certainly end any cooperation with Marshal Garrett and Lieutenant Morrison. But McKenna found himself considering the offer seriously, driven by a growing certainty that the standard military solution would solve nothing and create new problems. "When and where?" he asked. Surprise crossed Ayana's face, as if she hadn't expected him to agree so readily. "Tomorrow, when the sun is highest. Follow Apache Creek into the mountains until you reach the place where 3 stones stand like guardians. Come alone, and bring no weapons that cannot be used for hunting." "And if this is a trap?" For the first time, Ayana smiled, transforming her serious expression into something that made McKenna's breath catch in his throat. "Then you will die knowing that an Apache woman was cleverer than a white rancher. But I think you are not a man who fears such things, or you would not have survived in this land." As she turned her horse to leave, McKenna called out, "Ayana, why trust me with this?" She looked back over her shoulder, and in her dark eyes he saw something that struck him deeper than her earlier words. "Because in your dreams, you have seen a woman like me, and in my dreams, I have seen a man like you. Sometimes the spirits speak to us of futures we must choose to make real." With those words, she rode away, leaving McKenna standing alone in the desert with his world fundamentally changed. The woman who had raided his ranch had somehow looked into his soul and found something he hadn't known was there. As he rode back to face the federal authorities, one thought echoed in his mind with startling clarity. Ayana was right. In his deepest dreams, he had indeed seen a woman like her, strong, intelligent, uncompromising in her convictions, yet capable of touching something in him that no other person ever had. The recognition was both thrilling and terrifying, because it meant that everything he thought he knew about his life was about to change. That evening, as he sat with Marshal Garrett and Lieutenant Morrison around their campfire, McKenna made a decision that would alter the course of events for everyone involved. Instead of revealing his meeting with Ayana, he suggested a different approach to the Apache problem. "Marshal, I've been thinking about what you said regarding Geronimo's influence on local bands. What if these raids aren't about warfare at all? What if they're about something else entirely?" Garrett looked up from the map he was studying. "Such as?" "Survival. I've lived in this territory long enough to see how the reservation system works. Or doesn't work. If the Apache agents are corrupt, if promised supplies aren't reaching the people who need them, then raiding becomes a matter of necessity rather than choice." Lieutenant Morrison bristled at the suggestion. "Mr. McKenna, are you implying that the United States government is somehow responsible for these attacks?" "I'm suggesting that if we want to stop the raiding, we need to address the reasons why it's happening. Killing a few warriors will just create martyrs and more violence. But if we can solve the underlying problems, we might achieve actual peace." The conversation continued late into the night, with McKenna carefully planting seeds of doubt about the military solution while avoiding any mention of his planned meeting with Chief Nalnish. By the time the federal officers retired to their bedrolls, he had succeeded in creating enough uncertainty to buy the time he needed. As McKenna lay under the stars that night, his thoughts kept returning to Ayana and her enigmatic final words. The idea that their meeting had been somehow predetermined, that their dreams had prepared them for this moment, should have seemed absurd to a practical man like himself. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Tomorrow, he would ride into the mountains to meet with people who were considered enemies of his government and his way of life. He would risk his reputation, his safety, and possibly his life on the word of a woman he had spoken with for mere minutes. By any rational measure, he was making a tremendous mistake. But as he drifted off to sleep, Thomas McKenna knew with absolute certainty that he was about to make the most important decision of his life. Whatever happened in those mountains, whatever truths he discovered about the Apache raids, whatever consequences followed from his choice to trust Ayana, nothing would ever be the same again. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the image of her smile and the promise it carried of futures that could be chosen and made real through courage and understanding. In his dreams that night, he rode through landscapes he had never seen, beside a woman whose strength matched his own, toward horizons that promised both challenge and hope in equal measure. Dawn broke clear and cold as McKenna prepared for his journey into the Chiricahua Mountains. He told his foreman that he was riding the north boundary fence, a task that would legitimately keep him away from the ranch for most of the day. Marshal Garrett and Lieutenant Morrison were planning their own reconnaissance mission to the east, giving McKenna the opportunity he needed to slip away unnoticed. As he rode toward Apache Creek, McKenna found himself thinking about the risks he was taking. Meeting with Chief Nalnish without military escort violated every convention of territorial law. If discovered, he could face charges ranging from collaboration with hostiles to treason. Yet something deeper than logic drove him forward, a conviction that traditional approaches had failed and would continue to fail until someone took the chance to understand the human reality behind the conflict. The trail into the mountains followed ancient paths used by Apache people for countless generations. McKenna had ridden these routes before during hunting trips, but never with such awareness of their significance. Every twisted pine and weathered boulder seemed to hold stories of the people who had called this harsh landscape home long before the first white settlers arrived. The deeper he rode into Apache territory, the more he understood why they fought so desperately to remain here. The 3 guardian stones Ayanna had mentioned stood in a small meadow where Apache Creek formed a natural pool. The rocks were enormous granite monoliths that rose from the earth like ancient sentinels, their surfaces marked by centuries of wind and weather. Apache petroglyphs covered the lower portions of each stone, telling stories in symbols that McKenna could not read, but somehow felt in his bones. Ayanna emerged from the trees on the far side of the meadow, but she was not alone. 3 Apache warriors accompanied her, their faces painted for what McKenna hoped was ceremony rather than war. The men remained at a distance while Ayanna rode forward to meet him, her expression serious but not hostile. "You came," she said, and McKenna detected a note of surprise in her voice. "Many white men speak of honor, but few risk anything to prove their words. I said I would come. In my world, that means something, and in mine as well." Ayanna gestured toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains. "My father waits at the sacred spring. The warriors will ride with us, but they will not interfere unless you prove to be treacherous." "And how would I prove to be treacherous?" "By reaching for weapons when peaceful words would serve better, by speaking lies when truth is needed, by showing disrespect for the sacred places of my people." Her dark eyes held his steadily. "These are the ways white men have proven treacherous in the past." The implicit challenge in her words stung because McKenna recognized their truth. The history of relations between his people and hers was written in broken treaties and betrayed trust. If he wanted something different, he would have to prove himself worthy of it through actions rather than words. The ride to the sacred spring took nearly 2 hours through increasingly rugged terrain. McKenna marveled at the skill with which Ayanna and the warriors navigated paths that seemed to exist only in their minds. They moved through the landscape with the kind of intimacy that came from generations of accumulated knowledge, reading signs in the arrangement of rocks and the growth patterns of vegetation that revealed the presence of water, game, and potential danger. Chief Nalnish waited in a grove of ancient oaks beside a spring that bubbled from deep within the mountain. He was a man in his 60s, with gray streaking his long black hair and lines etched deeply into his weathered face. But his eyes remained sharp and alert, and he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had never surrendered his sense of purpose despite years of struggle against impossible odds. The chief wore traditional Apache clothing, but McKenna noticed details that spoke of adaptation to changing times. His moccasins showed repairs made with trade materials, and his rifle was a modern Winchester that had clearly seen careful maintenance. This was not a man trapped in the past, but someone trying to preserve his people's future in a rapidly changing world. "Welcome, McKenna," Chief Nailnish said in English that carried only a slight accent. "My daughter says you wish to understand why we take what we need rather than accept what is given to us. Sit, and I will tell you stories that your government does not want you to hear." They gathered around a small fire that one of the warriors had built in a ring of stones, blackened by countless previous uses. McKenna accepted the position offered to him, recognizing the honor being extended to him as a guest in this sacred place. Ayanna sat across from him, translating occasionally when her father shifted into Apache for concepts that did not translate well into English. "3 summers ago," Chief Nailnish began, "Agent Harrison came to our reservation with promises from Washington. He said our people would receive monthly supplies of flour, beef, and blankets. He said our children could attend the agency school to learn the white man's ways while still honoring Apache traditions. He said we could remain on our ancestral lands if we proved our commitment to peace." The chief paused to add wood to the fire, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "For 6 months, these promises were kept. Our people learned to supplement traditional foods with government rations. Some of the young men found work with the cattle ranchers, earning money to buy things our families needed. It seemed that perhaps the old prophecies were wrong, that white men and Apache could share this land without one destroying the other." "What changed?" McKenna asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Agent Harrison was replaced by Agent Crawford, a man who saw our people not as human beings with rights, but as obstacles to profit." The bitterness in Chief Nailnish's voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "Crawford began selling our rations to merchants in Tucson, keeping the money for himself. When our people complained of hunger, he told them they were ungrateful for the government's generosity. When children became sick from lack of food, he blamed their parents for not learning to live like white people." Ayanna spoke for the first time since they had sat down. "Last winter, 7 children died of illnesses that proper food would have prevented. Crawford told the soldiers at Fort Bowie that the deaths were caused by Apache resistance to civilized ways of living. He requested more troops to maintain order on the reservation." The picture emerging was even worse than McKenna had imagined. Systematic corruption was not only stealing from Apache families, but was also being used to justify increased military pressure on people who were essentially prisoners in their own homeland. The raids that had brought federal attention to the region were acts of desperation by parents watching their children starve. "Why haven't you reported Crawford's corruption to higher authorities?" McKenna asked. Chief Nailnish smiled sadly. "To whom should we report? Crawford's superiors receive written accounts of his success in managing the Apache. They see reports of peaceful conditions and efficient distribution of supplies. Who would believe the word of Indians against such documentation? Have you tried working through sympathetic white people, missionaries perhaps, or territorial officials?" "Most missionaries support the reservation system because they believe it will help them convert our people to Christianity. Territorial officials profit from the contracts Crawford arranges for supplies that never reach our families. The few white people who might listen to our concerns live too far away to witness what happens here." The conversation continued through the morning as Chief Nailnish detailed the systematic destruction of his people's attempts to adapt to the changing world. McKenna learned of Apache families who had tried to establish farms only to have their crops confiscated by Crawford for supposed violations of reservation rules. He heard about young Apache men who had been jailed on fabricated charges after asking questions about missing supplies. Most heartbreaking of all, he learned about the school where Apache children were punished for speaking their native language and forbidden to practice traditional customs. "So you decided to take what was being stolen from you," McKenna said when the chief finished his account. Not immediately. First, we tried to work within the system your people created. We sent delegations to speak with Crawford. We wrote letters to territorial authorities. We even sent a representative to speak with officials in Washington. Chief Nalnish's expression grew hard. Crawford had our representative arrested for leaving the reservation without permission. He spent 3 months in the territorial prison before charges were dropped for lack of evidence. The raids were a last resort. Yes. When children are dying and peaceful requests are ignored, a leader must choose between watching his people disappear or fighting to preserve them. We chose to fight, but not in the way our grandfathers fought. Instead of making war against all white people, we decided to take only what we needed to survive, and only from those who had enough to spare. The moral complexity of the situation struck McKenna with full force. By any legal standard, the Apache raids constituted theft and should be punished accordingly. But the moral reality was that the raids represented desperate attempts by parents to feed their children with resources that had been stolen from them by corrupt officials. The federal forces preparing to attack Chief Nalnish's band would be acting to protect a system that was slowly murdering innocent people through neglect and greed. "What do you want from me?" McKenna asked, echoing the question he had posed to Ayanna the previous day. "Help us find a way to tell our story to people who have the power to make changes. Crawford's corruption extends beyond our reservation. Other Apache bands, other tribes, are suffering from similar problems. If honest men knew what was happening, perhaps they would demand justice. And if I can't find such people, if the system is too corrupt to reform?" Chief Nalnish exchanged a look with his daughter before answering. "Then we will continue to take what our families need to survive, and we will face whatever consequences come from that choice. But at least we will have tried to find a better way." The afternoon was spent in detailed discussions about potential solutions. McKenna learned about specific incidents of corruption that could be documented and verified. He gathered names of witnesses who might be willing to testify if they could be assured of protection from retaliation. Most importantly, he began to understand the cultural and spiritual dimensions of the conflict that went far beyond simple questions of law and order. For the Apache people, the land itself was sacred, imbued with the spirits of ancestors and the promise of future generations. The reservation system didn't just confine them geographically, it severed them from the spiritual foundations of their identity. When Crawford prevented them from visiting sacred sites or conducting traditional ceremonies, he was attacking the very core of their existence as a people. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Chief Nalnish prepared to conclude their meeting. "McKenna, you have listened with respect and spoken with honesty. This gives me hope that not all white men have forgotten how to see beyond their own interests. But I must ask you a question that will determine what happens next. Ask. The soldiers who camp at your ranch seek to track us to this place and attack our families. Will you lead them here, or will you find ways to protect the innocent people who depend on me for their survival?" The question cut to the heart of McKenna's dilemma. His agreement with Marshal Garrett required him to provide information about Apache activities in the region. Failing to report this meeting would constitute a betrayal of that agreement and could result in serious legal consequences. But leading federal forces to attack families whose only crime was trying to survive would violate every moral principle he held dear. "I won't lead them here," McKenna said without hesitation. "But I can't guarantee they won't find you through other means. The Marshal is experienced at tracking, and Lieutenant Morrison is eager to prove himself in combat. Then we will move our camp deeper into the mountains, to places where horses cannot easily follow." Chief Nalnish stood, signaling the end of their formal meeting. "But first, there is something else you must know." He gestured to Ayanna, who had remained largely silent during the afternoon's discussions. "My daughter is not only a skilled warrior and leader, she is also the keeper of our people's stories. the one who preserves the knowledge that connects us to our ancestors and guides us toward our future. In the old days, she would have married a strong Apache warrior and raised children to carry on our traditions. But these are not the old days. McKenna felt his pulse quicken as he sensed the direction of the chief's words. Ayanna has seen 27 winters, and she has refused all offers of marriage from Apache men. When I asked her why, she said the spirits had shown her dreams of a different future, one that would require her to walk between two worlds. I did not understand her meaning until yesterday, when she told me of her meeting with you. Ayanna spoke for the first time in hours, her voice steady but intense. In my dreams, I have seen myself standing beside a white man who understood that strength comes not from conquering others, but from protecting them. I have seen myself teaching Apache children while learning white children's ways. I have seen peace that comes not from surrender, but from mutual respect and understanding. The implications of her words sent shockwaves through McKenna's mind. She was describing a vision of interracial cooperation that transcended the usual patterns of conquest and subjugation. More personally, she was suggesting that their meeting had been part of a larger destiny that neither of them fully understood, but both were being called to embrace. And if I told you that I had dreams of a similar woman before we ever met? McKenna asked quietly. Chief Nalnish smiled for the first time that day. Then I would say that sometimes the spirits speak to both Apache and white people when they have important work to accomplish together. The ride back toward the three guardian stones took place in contemplative silence. McKenna's mind reeled with the implications of everything he had learned. The Apache raids were morally justified responses to systematic oppression. The federal solution would only perpetuate injustice while creating new cycles of violence. Most disturbing of all, he was falling in love with a woman whose world stood in fundamental opposition to his own. When they reached the meadow where the guardian stone stood, Ayanna dismissed the warriors with instructions to return to their families. For the first time since their initial encounter, she and McKenna were alone together. The isolation should have felt dangerous, given the tension surrounding them, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "What will you do now?" she asked as they sat beside the pool to rest their horses. "I'll try to find people who can document Crawford's corruption and bring pressure for his removal. I'll look for legal ways to address the problems your people face without resorting to violence." McKenna paused, knowing his next words would carry enormous weight. "And I'll try to protect your father's band from federal retaliation while those efforts are underway. You understand that helping us makes you an enemy of your own people? Some of my people. Others will support doing the right thing once they understand the truth." Ayanna studied his face intently, as if trying to read the sincerity of his commitment in his eyes. "And what of the dreams we have both shared? What of the future the spirits have shown us?" McKenna felt his heart hammering as he struggled to find words for feelings that defied easy expression. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us, but I know that meeting you has changed something fundamental in my life. I know that I want to be the kind of man worthy of the respect you've shown me. And I know that whatever challenges we face, I want to face them alongside you." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge across an enormous chasm. When Ayanna finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that would transform both their lives. "Then we will make the spirit's vision real, Thomas McKenna. We will find ways to protect my people while building bridges between our worlds. We will face the anger of those who profit from hatred and division, and we will trust that love and understanding are stronger than fear and prejudice." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the meadow, McKenna and Ayanna sat together beside the sacred pool and planned their strategy for the dangerous days ahead. They would return to their separate worlds to gather allies and resources, but they would remain connected by bonds that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. McKenna knew that when he rode back to his ranch that evening, everything would appear exactly as he had left it. But the reality was that his entire life had been fundamentally altered by his encounter with Chief Nalnish and his growing connection to Ayanna. Tomorrow he would face Marshal Garrett and Lieutenant Morrison with knowledge that made their planned military actions seem not just misguided, but morally unconscionable. More challenging still, he would have to find ways to protect people he was coming to care about while maintaining his cover as a loyal citizen cooperating with federal authorities. The balancing act would require all his skill as a negotiator and leader, but failure would mean watching innocent people die for the crimes of corrupt officials. As he prepared to leave the meadow, Ayanna touched his hand with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the strength he had witnessed in her earlier. "Be careful, Thomas. There are white men who will kill you for the kindness you have shown my people. And there are Apache who will never trust any white man, no matter how honorable his intentions. The same warning applies to you. Some of my people will see you as nothing more than a dangerous savage who needs to be eliminated. And some of your people may view any cooperation with whites as betrayal of Apache independence. Then we must prove them wrong by succeeding in ways they think impossible." Their farewell was brief, but intense, charged with the recognition that they might not survive the challenges ahead. As McKenna rode back through the mountains toward his ranch, he carried with him not just information about Apache grievances and federal corruption, but a transformed understanding of what was possible when people chose courage over convenience and understanding over prejudice. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky when McKenna finally reached his ranch house. Jake Patterson met him at the stable with news that the federal officers had returned from their reconnaissance mission with plans to move against the Apache camp within the next few days. Tomorrow, McKenna would have to begin the most delicate negotiations of his life, finding ways to redirect federal attention toward the real causes of the Apache raids while protecting the people he had sworn to help. But tonight, for the first time in years, Thomas McKenna fell asleep with his heart full of purpose and possibility. In his dreams, he walked through landscapes of unimaginable beauty, beside a woman whose strength matched his own, building a future that honored both their peoples while transcending the limitations that others insisted were insurmountable. The next morning brought unwelcome news that forced McKenna to accelerate his plans. Marshal Garrett had received a telegram from Fort Bowie reporting that Apache raids had struck 2 more ranches during the night, killing 3 men and making off with dozens of horses. Lieutenant Morrison was demanding immediate action, arguing that further delay would only encourage more violence. McKenna knew immediately that these new raids were not the work of Chief Nalnish's band. The timing and tactics were all wrong, suggesting either a different Apache group or deliberate provocation by someone seeking to escalate the conflict. But explaining this to the federal officers would require revealing knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess. "Tom, I need you to be straight with me," Marshal Garrett said as they examined maps of the local terrain. "You know this country better than anyone. If you were tracking Apache raiders, where would you look first?" The question put McKenna in an impossible position. Giving accurate information would lead the federal forces away from Chief Nalnish's relocated camp, but might result in attacks on other innocent Apache families. Providing misleading guidance would eventually be discovered and would destroy his credibility when he most needed it. "Marshal, before we start planning attacks, shouldn't we try to understand why these raids are increasing? In 15 years on this land, I've learned that Apache people don't fight without reason. Something has changed recently, and we need to figure out what that is." Lieutenant Morrison interrupted before Garrett could respond. "Mr. McKenna, with respect, the reasons don't matter anymore. We have dead civilians and stolen property. Our job is to stop the raids and punish the people responsible, not to play amateur anthropologist." Lieutenant, my job is to protect my ranch and my workers. Your job is to restore order to this territory. We'll both do better if we understand what we're dealing with. The conversation continued in increasingly tense circles until Jake Patterson arrived with information that changed everything. A rider had come from Tucson with news that territorial authorities were launching an investigation into corruption among Indian agents. Someone with detailed knowledge of reservation conditions had provided evidence of systematic theft and abuse that demanded immediate action. McKenna felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. His letter to the territorial governor, written and dispatched the previous evening, had apparently reached sympathetic ears. But the investigation would also increase scrutiny of Apache activities and might accelerate military action before reforms could take effect. "This changes our priorities," Marshal Garrett said after reading the dispatch Patterson had brought. "If there's truth to these corruption allegations, we need to coordinate our actions with the territorial investigation. Lieutenant, I want you to ride to Fort Bowie and get updated orders from your commanding officer. We may need to delay our Apache operations until the political situation clarifies." Morrison's frustration was evident, but he accepted his orders with military discipline. His departure gave McKenna breathing room to continue gathering evidence while protecting Chief Nalnish's people from immediate attack. However, it also meant working alone against whatever forces were behind the escalating raids. That afternoon, McKenna made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Instead of waiting for official investigations to proceed through bureaucratic channels, he decided to ride to the reservation and confront Agent Crawford directly. If he could gather first-hand evidence of corruption, it would strengthen the territorial investigation and provide legal justification for addressing Apache grievances. The reservation headquarters consisted of a cluster of adobe buildings surrounded by a wooden stockade that gave the entire complex the appearance of a prison. Crawford's office occupied the largest building, its interior furnished with items that seemed far too expensive for a government employee's salary. The agent himself was a small, sharp-featured man whose nervous energy suggested someone constantly looking over his shoulder for threats. "Mr. McKenna, this is an unexpected visit," Crawford said, offering a handshake that McKenna noted was damp with perspiration. "I hope you're not here about cattle straying onto reservation land. I've told the Apache families repeatedly that they're not allowed to keep livestock that doesn't belong to them. Actually, I'm here about the recent raids. Marshal Garrett asked me to gather information about conditions on the reservation that might explain why some Apache families have turned to stealing." Crawford's expression shifted from nervousness to calculating cunning. "Mr. McKenna, I appreciate your civic spirit, but I don't think you understand how dangerous it is to suggest that the government bears any responsibility for Apache lawlessness. People in Washington don't like to hear that their policies aren't working perfectly." The threat was barely concealed, but it also confirmed McKenna's suspicions about Crawford's awareness of his own wrongdoing. An honest agent would have welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate the success of federal policies. Only someone with something to hide would try to discourage scrutiny. "I'm just trying to understand the situation. Can you show me your supply records for the past few months? It would help to know whether food shortages might be driving people to desperation." "Those records are confidential government documents. I can't share them with civilians without proper authorization." Crawford moved to position himself between McKenna and the filing cabinets that lined his office walls. "Perhaps you should discuss your concerns with Marshal Garrett or the territorial authorities. I'm sure they'll be very interested in examining those records themselves. The territorial governor has launched an investigation into Indian agent practices throughout the Southwest. I imagine inspectors will be here soon to conduct a complete audit of your operations." The color drained from Crawford's face, confirming that news of the investigation had not yet reached him. His response revealed the depth of his corruption and the desperation it had bred. "Mr. McKenna, I think there may be some misunderstanding about my administration of this reservation. Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately, away from official scrutiny that might complicate things unnecessarily. The attempted bribe was exactly what McKenna had hoped to provoke. Crawford's willingness to negotiate revealed his guilt while providing evidence that could be reported to territorial authorities. However, it also made McKenna a target for people with much to lose from exposure of their crimes. Agent Crawford, I think official scrutiny is exactly what this situation requires. The territorial investigation will determine whether reservation policies are being implemented properly or whether changes need to be made. McKenna left the reservation with the knowledge he needed, but also with the certainty that he had made himself a marked man. Crawford would undoubtedly report their conversation to whoever was protecting his criminal activities, and those people would take action to prevent their exposure. The next few days would bring danger from multiple directions. That evening brought a visitor who confirmed McKenna's fears. Samuel Hartley, a well-dressed man who claimed to represent business interests in Tucson, arrived at the ranch after dark with an offer that was clearly a threat in disguise. Mr. McKenna, I understand you've taken an interest in Indian affairs lately. That's commendable civic spirit, but it could also be dangerous in the current political climate. There are people who profit from the existing arrangements, and they don't like to see those arrangements questioned. Hartley's message was clear. Powerful interests were determined to maintain the corrupt system that was enriching them at Apache expense. McKenna's investigation threatened those profits and would be stopped by whatever means necessary. Mr. Hartley, I'm a simple rancher trying to understand why my neighbors are being killed and my livestock stolen. If existing arrangements aren't working, then they need to be changed. Perhaps. But change takes time, and rushing the process could have unfortunate consequences. For instance, it would be terrible if Apache raids targeted your ranch specifically, or if federal authorities received information suggesting that you were collaborating with hostile Indians. The double threat was expertly delivered. McKenna could be attacked by Apache raiders who were actually working for Crawford's patrons, or he could be arrested on fabricated charges of treason. Either way, his investigation would be discredited and terminated. I appreciate your concern for my safety, McKenna replied carefully. But I have confidence in the territorial authorities to conduct a fair and thorough investigation of any problems that exist. After Hartley's departure, McKenna knew he was running out of time. The corrupt network behind Crawford's activities was mobilizing to protect itself, and his own safety could not be guaranteed much longer. More importantly, Chief Nalnish's people remained vulnerable to attack by federal forces who still believed they were pursuing dangerous criminals rather than desperate families. The solution came to him with startling clarity. Instead of trying to work within a system that was controlled by the very people he was fighting, he needed to bypass that system entirely. The territorial investigation would eventually expose Crawford's corruption, but not quickly enough to prevent immediate violence. He needed to bring Chief Nalnish and Marshal Garrett together directly, allowing an honest federal officer to see the truth for himself. The next morning, McKenna sent messages to both men, asking them to meet him at a location where they could talk without interference from either corrupt officials or military subordinates who might act precipitously. The meeting would be dangerous for everyone involved, but it offered the best chance to prevent the tragedy that was otherwise inevitable. Chief Nalnish arrived first at the designated meeting place, a natural amphitheater hidden deep in the mountains where ancient Apache councils had once made decisions affecting their entire people. He brought only Ayanna with him, a gesture of trust that demonstrated his commitment to peaceful resolution despite the risks involved. "This is a dangerous gamble you propose," the chief said as they waited for Marshal Garrett to arrive. "If your marshal proves to be like other government men, we may not leave this place alive. If he proves to be like other government men, then we'll all have learned something important about the chances for justice in this territory," McKenna replied. "But I've watched Garrett work, and I believe he's an honest man trapped in a dishonest system." When Marshal Garrett arrived, his surprise at finding Apache leaders waiting for him was evident. But to his credit, he dismounted from his horse and approached the meeting with the caution of a professional rather than the hostility of a prejudiced man. "Chief Nalnish, I presume," Garrett said, offering a respectful nod rather than attempting a handshake that might be misinterpreted. "Mr. McKenna has asked me to listen to your side of recent events. I'm willing to do that, but I want your word that this meeting will remain peaceful." "You have my word, Marshal. We seek justice, not violence." What followed was 3 hours of the most honest conversation about Apache-white relations that any of them had ever experienced. Chief Nalnish presented detailed evidence of Crawford's corruption, including specific dates when rations had been diverted and names of witnesses who could verify his claims. He explained the impossible situation facing Apache families and the careful planning that had gone into raids designed to minimize violence while obtaining necessary supplies. Marshal Garrett listened with growing anger as he realized the extent to which he had been manipulated by corrupt officials. His experience in law enforcement had taught him to recognize truth when he heard it, and everything Chief Nalnish told him rang true in ways that official reports never had. "Chief, if even half of what you're telling me is accurate, then my men and I have been preparing to attack victims rather than criminals," Garrett said when the Apache leader finished his account. "But how do I verify these claims before someone gets killed?" "Ride to the reservation with me," Chief Nalnish proposed. "Speak with Apache families directly. Examine Crawford's supply warehouses. See for yourself whether the evidence supports the stories you've been told." The proposal was unprecedented. No federal marshal had ever conducted an investigation in partnership with Apache leaders. But Garrett was experienced enough to recognize that conventional approaches had failed and that new methods might be required to achieve justice. "If I agree to this, what guarantee do I have that you'll honor our agreement to end the raids?" "The word of Chief Nalnish has never been broken," Ayanna spoke for the first time since introductions had been made. "But we cannot promise to starve quietly while corrupt officials steal the food meant for our children, end the corruption, and the raids will end." The negotiation that followed established terms for a temporary truce while Garrett conducted his investigation. Chief Nalnish would move his people to a remote location where they could avoid contact with other federal forces. Garrett would examine reservation conditions and Crawford's records without warning the agent in advance. If evidence supported Apache claims, Garrett would arrest Crawford and support territorial efforts to reform the reservation system. Most importantly for McKenna, the agreement included provisions for ongoing communication between federal authorities and Apache leaders to prevent future misunderstandings. Ayanna would serve as translator and cultural liaison, working with territorial officials to establish new policies based on mutual respect rather than forced subjugation. As the meeting concluded, Marshal Garrett pulled McKenna aside for a private conversation. "Tom, what you've done here took tremendous courage, but it's also put you in significant danger. The people who profit from the current system won't tolerate this kind of interference." "Marshal, I've lived in this territory long enough to know that some things are worth the risk. If we can prevent a war and establish justice for people who deserve it, whatever dangers I face will be worth it." "And the Apache woman? I see the way you look at her, and I see the way she looks at you. Are you prepared for the consequences of that relationship?" McKenna glanced toward Ayanna, who was speaking quietly with her father in Apache while they prepared to leave. The sight of her strength and intelligence filled him with certainty about his answer. "Marshal, I've spent 15 years building a ranching country that most people consider uninhabitable. I've survived droughts, floods, Apache raids, and Mexican bandits. I think I can handle the challenges that come with loving a remarkable woman." The investigation that followed vindicated everything Chief Nalnish had claimed. Crawford's corruption was even more extensive than the Apache leader had known, involving not just theft of reservation supplies, but also illegal land sales and weapons trafficking. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, the agent attempted to flee the territory, but was captured by Garrett's men before he could reach the Mexican border. The territorial authorities moved quickly to implement reforms that addressed Apache grievances, while establishing legal frameworks for cooperation between Indian communities and white settlers. Agent Crawford was replaced by an honest administrator who worked directly with Chief Nalnish to develop policies that respected Apache culture while providing the resources families needed to survive. The new arrangements were not perfect, and tensions persisted between those on both sides who preferred conflict to cooperation. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice rather than conquest and subjugation. For McKenna and Ayanna, the success of their intervention created opportunities neither had dared to hope for. With peace established between their peoples, they could explore their relationship without the constant threat of violence that had shadowed their early meetings. The territorial governor, grateful for their role in exposing corruption and preventing war, appointed Ayanna as an official liaison between Apache communities and territorial authorities. The appointment was controversial among both whites and Apaches who opposed cooperation between the races. But it provided legal protection for their relationship while creating a framework for the kind of bridge building they had envisioned in their dreams. 6 months after their first meeting, Thomas McKenna and Ayanna were married in a ceremony that honored both Apache and white traditions. Chief Nalnish performed the Apache portions of the ritual, while a sympathetic minister from Tucson handled the legal requirements. The wedding took place at the sacred spring where McKenna had first met with Apache leaders, symbolizing the transformation of a place of negotiation into a site of personal and cultural union. The marriage was more than a personal commitment between two people who had found love across cultural boundaries. It represented a new model for relationships between Apache and white communities, demonstrating that mutual respect and understanding could overcome the prejudices that had fueled decades of conflict. Not everyone approved of the union. Some whites viewed McKenna as a traitor to his race, while some Apaches considered Ayanna's marriage a betrayal of traditional ways. Death threats and harassment forced the couple to remain vigilant about their safety, and they knew that their relationship would always challenge conventional expectations. But they also knew that their love had been forged in the crucible of moral crisis and had proven strong enough to overcome obstacles that would have defeated lesser commitments. Together, they had helped prevent a war and establish justice for people who had been denied it. Together, they had shown that the future could be different from the past if people had the courage to choose understanding over prejudice. As they stood together at their wedding ceremony, surrounded by family and friends from both communities, McKenna and Ayanna looked toward a future that would require continued struggle and sacrifice. They would face opposition from those who profited from division and hatred. They would have to prove repeatedly that cooperation between their peoples was possible and beneficial. But they would also have the satisfaction of knowing that their love had already changed the world in measurable ways. Apache children were no longer starving because of corrupt officials. White families were no longer dying in raids born of desperation. Peace reigned in a territory that had known primarily conflict. Most importantly, they had each other. In Ayanna, McKenna had found the strong woman who had haunted his dreams, someone whose courage and intelligence matched his own and whose presence made him a better man than he had ever thought possible. In Thomas, Ayanna had found the white man her visions had promised, someone who understood that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. As the sun set behind the mountains on their wedding day, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected the beauty of the harsh land they both loved, Thomas McKenna and Ayanna looked toward a horizon that promised both challenges and possibilities in equal measure. They had chosen to make real the future their dreams had shown them, and whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would face them together. The Apache woman who had raided his ranch had indeed haunted Thomas McKenna's dreams, but now she filled his waking hours with purpose and joy, proving that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Their love story would be remembered in both Apache oral traditions and territorial histories as proof that understanding and respect could triumph over prejudice and fear, creating possibilities that neither people could achieve alone. In the years that followed, their ranch became a place where Apache and white families gathered for celebrations and councils, where children of both cultures learned from each other, and where the dreams of peace their ancestors had shared slowly became reality. The woman who had once taken his horses had given him something far more valuable, a love that bridged two worlds and a future built on hope rather than fear.